Hey, I'm Tamara,
And I'm Grace.
and today we're going to be talking about journalism, ethics of journalism, exploitation of minors, and a lot of other crazy cool subjects.
Yep, Tamara's going to focus on the minors first, and then I'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a photographer who is taking an exploitative photo.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there is a lot of exploitation in modern day media and historically in media. And we see this in very famous examples, such as the example of Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz. She faced a lot of difficult working environment while working there, and her family actually blames her drug addiction and alcoholism after that movie, based on her experiences working there. And overall, she was not treated well as a child. Um, Another example of this in journalism is the Napalm Girl, who she is referenced as this to protect her real identity, although that is pretty well known on the media if you look into it. But to respect her identity, currently the image is just called the Napalm Girl. And it's about this photograph that was taken right after a bomb went off, and a bunch of chemicals got on these kids, and they're running and they're taking off their clothes because the chemicals are burning their skin. And the photo was taken of a very young girl while she was naked, and she grew up later to say that she thinks that she's very recognizable in this photo. She doesn't like this nude photo going around of her, and unfortunately, it is still used to this day around the talking of the Vietnam War, and this just goes to show that guidelines were not respected by taking a photo of a young nude girl without her consent or permission, and that is a example of a ethical journalism issue right there. So, since it's kind of known that the effects of exploiting minors has detrimental effects to their lives, why is it still practiced? Well, sometimes the sensationalism of children suffering can actually make a huge impact for the cause. This photo got a lot of American attention, and the Judy Garland movie obviously made a lot of money for producers. But overall, the manipulation of the media to get what they want is why minors are exploited and why anybody is exploited. Yeah. So, it's very important to know that minors can't consent to the photographs taken of them, even if they do say yes in the moment. They might not really recognize the full permanency of what could happen to that image or their words that they've been quoted on in maybe interviews. And overall, they need a parental permission first before using their information in a journalism project or article or being published. In the case of the Napalm Girl, this photo went famous after it was published by the photographer, and her whole family saw it, and she said she was very uncomfortable about the whole ordeal. It's important to know that every child has the right to confidentiality and privacy, and that is something that all journalists can agree on. It's also very important that there is informed consent. If a person is distressed or not in the right state of mind, for example, they're starving or injured, as we can see in the photo of the vulture and the girl is starving and isn't really aware of the photograph being taken, as her head is in her hands, and she's crouched over. And it's very important to recognize that a person has to be kind of out of their distressing situation before they can think through if they want a certain image to be released or their words to be released, and it's all about informed consent. The journalist has a obligation to tell the subject that this photo could go viral, this article could go viral. Like, you have to be mindful of what is being published. So when we look at what Susan Sontag has to say about photography, there's a quote from her: "To collect photographs is to collect the world." Overall, Sontag generally says that we become too reliant on photography to tell stories, and Sontag has a bit more of a reserved approach to taking photos, as she says that they have a time and a place, but maybe not so much taking a photo at every opportunity. and that way we can keep the importance of a photograph. It's also important to find other means of telling stories. For example, if you rely too much on a photo to depict every piece of imagery um, in your story instead of writing about it or explaining it, that's kind of like could be considered a cheap take. Instead of like putting the time into understanding it, you just take a photo and let the audience interpret the rest of it. It's important to remember that journalists are people too, and they have an ethical responsibility to help those around them if they seem distressed. And when this like revolves around children, it can be a very sensitive topic, especially when it revolves around vulnerable people, or people who can't fully consent to their photos going viral. And then there's controversy surrounding the topic.
So, why do photographers feel justified to take photos of other people who are experiencing moments of suffering? I found this quote that I feel like is really relevant and helps us understand. It says, "The act of photographing seems to inculcate a psychological conception of the self as observer rather than agent, such that even the photographer's mind can be so closely allied with the camera to the extent that any intervention is out of the question." And this is kind of mirrored by, I found an article that has a lot of quotes from photographers who have taken photos right before disaster struck, and they often say that their instinct is to view themselves as a photographer first and a human being second. So what does this remind us of that we talked about in class this semester? I would say definitely Marshall McLuhan. The camera has become an extension of their body. They are the medium in which they produce media, which is kind of saying like that their instinct is first to use their hand as a camera and not to use their hand to reach out and help somebody who needs it. And I have an example of this, but just quick content warning that the photo I'm using as an example does depict domestic violence. So if you need to do anything to protect yourself from that, go for it. So the photo is actually called Domestic Violence. It is by Donna Ferrato, and it is a real photo that she took. She was living with this couple, and it is the moment that the man hits his wife. So why is this photo such a good example? You can actually see this photo was taken in their bathroom, and Donna Ferrato herself is reflected in the bathroom mirror. So this is important because it allows any viewer of the photo to not only put themselves in the shoes of the subject, but also to put themselves in the photographer's shoes. They can see that she is present in this moment and that her decision was to hold up a camera to this event and not to help what was going on and help the wife. So a lot of people are quick to blame the media. Is it the media's fault that this is even a demand, that this is even a thing that exists? Susan Sontag herself even says public attention is steered by the attentions of the media, but who is the media if not the public? The media is just essentially made up of members of the public. And even if vulgar photos have been proven to hold attention longer and therefore be more financially viable, the media is not who decided that this is a phenomenon that exists. It is just human nature that those photos hold attention longer than other ones. And there's also the point of what about societies that don't have established media? They are still able to view these photographs. Also, it's important to ask, does it matter what we know about the photo? Going back to Roland Barthes, there's studium and punctum, and they refer to the implicit and explicit content of a photo, but there's also a further level of context for what the events are that lead up to and follow photos like these. And are audiences able to deem a photo ethical or not ethical if they don't have this context? So an example that I wanted to use is the vulture and the little girl. So just a quick content warning that I put that picture on the next slide. It does depict a starving child. So if you need to do something to avoid that, go for it. Here's the photo. It was taken by Kevin Carter. And then I have some information about the photo itself, the events that led up to and followed to the taking of the photo that may provide further context for what was going on. For example, the backlash to this photo was so severe that Kevin Carter unfortunately took his own life at the age of 33. He was often referred to as kind of like a second vulture preying on the girl as she was experiencing this horrible moment. He does claim that after he took the photo, he chased the vulture away and waited to make sure that the little girl got up and kept walking. She was headed towards a food shelter at the time. But he admits that he did not touch her or help her out in any way, and he claims that this is because he was told not to ever touch famine victims, that they may have communicable diseases. Additionally, it has been argued that this photo alone may have led to a majority of donations to famine relief funds in Sudan at the time. However, does this matter? Even if we can't tell any of this from looking at the photo, does it justify the taking of the photo? Now that we have this information, do we feel that it's okay that he took this photo? Only you can make that decision for yourself. Personally, I don't think that's justified, but that is something that you need to decide on your own. And then also there's a question that can be asked of how can photographers kind of be expected to know what to do in dangerous situations? Why do we expect more from them and expect them to help as opposed to people who are maybe experiencing the bystander effect or things like that? And the answer is that, we can't expect them to know what to do and to be able to solve any problems. However, there is a difference between taking a photo when you're unable to help somebody and then publicizing a photo of somebody who's suffering. And that is because by publicizing a photo, a photographer is exercising power and authority over the subject by inviting others to non-consensually view the subject in a moment of suffering. Publicizing photos of tragedy has a much bigger effect than the actual taking of the photo, and whether that effect is positive or negative, it's still something that they chose to do when they were in a moment of, clear mind after the tragedy has occurred. They still make the decision that the photo should be seen without often consulting the subject of the photo. And these are a few of the sources that I used.
And here's some additional sources.
Honestly, Tamara, I learned a lot from yours. I didn't think specifically about children when I was working on my project, but that's like an even further level of what's going on. It reminded me, obviously of the vulture and the little girl, that's a child in the photo that's being portrayed. That she couldn't give consent to that. It also reminded me of the Nirvana baby. I hear that he's suing Nirvana now, which is really interesting, but I guess you're right that he couldn't have consented to that naked photo of him it became so famous, and he's known for that now. It's inescapable.
I completely agree. I definitely would have to say I got a lot of information from yours that photographers, I think we had an overlap. Photographers are people. They have their own lives and selves to look out for, and to not get communicable diseases from people, but also balancing ethics of, do I help people? What can I do to help without hurting myself?
Right.
I think it's very interesting also how you bring up Kevin Carter's, I think it's very interesting also that you bring up the idea that a camera is an extension of oneself. So you have to protect, your livelihood with your camera. And
right. Yeah.
capture what you see without hurting people.
Yeah, even if you take the photo just because that's your instinct, should you publish it becomes the bigger question. It also reminded me when you were talking about Judy Garland, I don't know if you've seen the movie Judy, but it talks about it depicts the repercussions that had on her life as an adult, what the exploitation of herself as a child did to her permanently, and even how it had effects on her children too. It's really interesting, how big of an impact something like that can have.
Exactly, and the long-term effects of ethics of journalism and what we're taking photos of matters,
Yeah, I feel like we've learned a lot on this project.
Thank you guys for listening. Are there any questions that you guys may have for us? We are all ears.
Drop them in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.